Good evening. The crippled Apollo 13 spacecraft is winding up its final full day in space tonight, apparently on course for a Pacific Ocean splashdown around 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, 555 miles southeast of Samoa. The latest word is that there are ample supplies of water, oxygen, power, and other consumables. The astronauts themselves are of reasonably good cheer, but when they must work in the command module, they are cold. It's down to around 45 degrees, and they are sleeping huddled together in the warmer lunar module. Each moment that ticks away is another in which nothing more has gone wrong to endanger their lives. The next critical moments come tomorrow morning. Just about 7 a.m. Eastern Time, they'll climb back into their command ship and once again turn its power on, power that has been down except for intermittent tests since Monday night's explosion. That power has to work, and the astronauts will breathe easier when it does. Then just before 8:30 a.m., they'll jettison the long-dead service module, and 2.5 hours later, the lunar module that has been their lifeboat back from the moon. Out at Bethpage, Long Island, Nelson Benton is with test astronauts Scott McLeod of Grumman and Leo Krupp of North American Rockwell, and they can show us tomorrow's critical maneuvers.
The critical pre-entry activity begins about 4.5 hours before scheduled splashdown, shortly after 8 a.m. Eastern Time. It is a matter of separating the docked lunar module and command module from the service module. It must be done in such a manner that there is no danger of further contact between the two, but it must be done delicately enough that the homeward-bound trajectory is not disturbed. It takes teamwork from both the command module and from the lunar module. Our pilots are Leo Krupp and Scott McLeod.
Leo, Scott, stand by for a 1 foot per second thrust to the command module.
Roger, standing by for service module separation.
Mark. 0.5. 0.7. 1.0 mark.
Command service module sep.
Reversing thrust. 0.5. 0.7. Mark 1.0.
Roger, Scotty.
The next separation comes after the entire crew is back in the command module, the separation of the command module from the lunar module. Leo?
Nelson, the final LEM SEP will occur 1 hour before we enter the Earth's atmosphere. At this time, the command module systems will be all powered up. All 3 crew members will be back in the command module. We'll have the tunnel hatches back in place. However, the tunnel is to the LEM is going to be left pressurized. When they're ready to separate the LEM, these two switches on the main panel will be actuated, which will separate the 2 vehicles, and the pressure that's in the tunnel will force the 2 vehicles apart, causing the LEM to drift out to a safe distance. Now, this is exactly the way Tom Stafford separated on Apollo 10, and it worked very successfully, so it has been flight tested. The only difference in this one will be that we will not have a service module aboard, so the attitude of the command module may vary slightly, but this should not be a problem.
If these separations and related activities go all right to this point, from here on, it's just a matter of re-entering the way they always have. Walter?
That's right. After the LEM is jettisoned by a couple of hours, the command module plunges through the Earth's atmosphere to its splashdown. The weather at the splashdown area is reported good tonight, and besides the recovery carrier Iwo Jima, 4 Russian ships are said to be nearby. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, once faced death in space in his wildly tumbling Gemini 8 flight 4 years ago. Today, newsmen at Houston ask him about a spaceman's secret thoughts at such moments of crisis.
That concern is a real one. It always exists in the back of your mind, but I suspect that the attitude that they reflect over the communication loops reflects what they're really thinking. Namely, they're trying to do each and every job precisely as well as they can, not overlook anything, such that the situation that you conjure won't happen, at least as a result of their own doing. It would have to be unavoidable.
I ask if you ever felt any similar doubts, any doubts that this sort of thing could happen to you just as you were about to begin your mission, or while it was underway, for that matter.
No, when you're flying, you don't concern yourself with those things. Those judgments and decisions are made before flight. When you are reviewing the systems and the flight plan, and any time you find what you think might be a weakness you attack it at that time during the preparation phase. And once you lift off, you don't worry about those alternatives anymore. You just do the best job that you can with the commitment you've already made at that point.
In spite of the tensions that have been ever present since Apollo 13 ran into trouble Monday night, the astronauts' families maintain at least a surface calm. Ed Rabel reports from Houston.
If you are 4-year-old Jeffrey Lovell, you probably do not share the anxiety of others in your family about your father, and you go to nursery school with few cares. But if you are Mary Haise, expecting your 4th child this summer, and your husband is a rookie astronaut in a crippled spacecraft, you try to avoid the anxiety by going to the home of a friend. Marilyn Lovell, whose husband is commander of Apollo 13, also comes to the get-together at Chief Astronaut Deke Slayton's house.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you today.
Later, both wives pose for pictures, but will not answer reporters' questions. If the flight had been normal, they might have been talking about their husband's walk on the moon.
In Denver, the parents of bachelor astronaut John Swigert said they were feeling great after last night's successful burn. Russia's cosmonauts sent a message to the astronauts saying, "We are following your flight with great attention and anxiety. We wish wholeheartedly your safe return to our Mother Earth." Our coverage of the final hours of Apollo 13 begins with the CBS Morning News at 7 a.m. Eastern Time and continues right through splashdown and recovery.
Is now within 95 miles of the Earth and speeding toward a landing in the Pacific. But there still are a number of critical things which must be done successfully before the astronauts are hauled up on the carrier Iwo Jima. They must make a small course correction tomorrow morning, then cast off the surface module. After that, they must get rid of the moon landing ship which powered their trip back to Earth, and only then, finally, will they re-enter the atmosphere and parachute down into the ocean, shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern Time.
The astronauts are cold, but still safe, speeding toward the Earth at more than 4,000 miles an hour. The low temperatures in the spacecraft, caused by a reluctance to use electricity for heat, are an annoyance, but not yet a serious problem. One of the astronauts told the Manned Spacecraft Center here in Houston this afternoon, "It is like living in a refrigerator." Much of the astronauts' day was spent today getting instructions from Mission Control on tomorrow's maneuvers. Detailed and complicated instructions because the sequence of events to be carried out in space tomorrow has never been carried out before. Here at the Manned Spacecraft Center, another theory has been advanced which could explain the explosion of an oxygen tank which led last Monday night to this emergency. It is theorized that some sort of foreign matter may have been in the oxygen tank. The troubles of Apollo 13 have not shaken the confidence of other astronauts, at least not in public. Many of them have publicly stated their confidence in the space program.
We inherently expect a certain amount of these things to occur, and it's no great surprise. Perhaps I think we're more surprised when things run perfectly well, as they did on Apollo 11. As a matter of fact, I'm still somewhat amazed that everything worked so well during that flight. We spend a great deal of our time in preparing for these kinds of situations, and usually when they do happen, they're a little bit different than anything we ever prepared for, though. I don't fault the design engineers or the test teams in this case for this particular incident. I'm sure that it was just one of those 1,000,000-to-1 shots that you just can't properly prepare for, or don't adequately know how to prepare for in this case.
Tomorrow morning, Eastern Time, the spacecraft will approach the Earth looking like this. This is the way it looks now. About 5 hours before it reaches the Earth's atmosphere, the men in the command module will jettison this part here called the service module, and it'll float away in space. That will leave these two parts of the spacecraft, the LEM here and the command module here. About an hour before they hit the atmosphere, they will separate the LEM from the command module, and you all remember this. We've seen this on previous flights coming in with the men aboard.
And here's one of the men who was aboard the last time, Captain Alan Bean, astronaut on Apollo 12. Now, have I said that correctly?
You sure have, and it looks like that the 5 hours jettisoned for the service module and the 1 hour for the LEM will give us plenty of time to work any other checks we have in, plenty of time.
All right, now the command module has been without power since Monday night.
Yes.
Except for brief periods. Do we have any guarantee that this cold, powerless ship can be powered up enough so that it can perform the tasks it has to perform?
Yes, we do. North American has been running a number of tests, as we have here, taking a look at the temperatures that are on the electrical system and many of the components, and determining, and have determined, in fact, that they'll be able to be warmed up sufficiently to do the job they're designed to do. So that looks like a pretty straightforward job right now.
What about the relationship between this is the part of the spacecraft where the trouble began on Monday night, and when it moves away from the heat shield, the porous heat shield, is it likely to leave any particles, any broken particles there near the heat shield which could cause trouble on re-entry?
Not really. You may remember that all the electrical wiring and everything that separates the command module from the service module is in the command module. And as far as we know, absolutely nothing has gone wrong there. So the separation ought to take place in a completely nominal fashion. Even if there were small particles on the base of the heat shield, it wouldn't affect the command module during re-entry. There's quite a lot of extra heat shield built in just for such a...
And do you see any problems in separating and getting two astronauts out of here and all three of them into the command module and separating the command module from the LEM?
No, mainly because we're going to use the same techniques we've used around the moon a number of times and certainly in Earth orbit. So powering down the LEM, getting inside, closing the hatch, and actually blowing the LEM away from the command module is typically a nominal maneuver. Incidentally, and I think a good point is, the minute that the LEM moves away from the command module, we got at about an hour out no longer any emergency situation. We're in the situation we've always been in when returning from the moon.
With enough power in here so that you are back as you were on Apollo 12 coming in.
That's right.
So then it's a normal re-entry.
That's right. The emergency for all cases is over once we separate the command module from
Nevertheless, it's never been done before this way, and everybody's worried. Are you worried?
No. We've been doing a lot of simulation here of the techniques that we're going to use here. The crew has demonstrated that they're cool under the worst possible conditions, and the flight controllers have demonstrated the same thing, so I think that tomorrow is going to run rather smoothly. It'll be almost a routine re-entry, if that's the word.
Whatever fears the space agency may have had concerning the weather at splashdown were dissipated today. A tropical storm moved 700 miles away from the target area northeast of New Zealand. NBC News will cover the splashdown of Apollo 13 live on television and radio. Television coverage begins at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Radio coverage starts a half hour earlier.
The Apollo 13 astronauts and their crippled spaceship are now more than halfway home from the moon. Despite all the problems, one NASA official said today there's no reason why there shouldn't be a perfectly normal splashdown. But obviously, each event, each hour between now and splashdown in the Pacific tomorrow afternoon is quite literally a matter of life and death. ABC science editor Jules Bergman has a report on what happened in space today and what lies ahead for tomorrow.
It's cold up there in Apollo 13 on this last leg of a harrowing journey for Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert. Bone-chilling cold, down to about 45 degrees in the powered-down command module. So cold that all three astronauts attempted to sleep huddled together in the cramped cockpit of the lunar module last night. One man kept the watch, anxiously eyeing the instruments, monitoring their life-giving oxygen, water, and power. And it won't be much better tonight. The LEM with partial power is somewhat warmer. Tired, but with the worst behind them, Lovell, Haise, and Swigert are now getting ready for the most critical re-entry we've ever attempted. Early tomorrow morning, a final small mid-course maneuver to hopefully plant the command module smack in the middle of the South Pacific splashdown area. Just after 8 a.m. Eastern Time, they'll separate from the service module, where the oxygen tank exploded that aborted their lunar mission and nearly cost them their lives. They'll pitch the LEM upward like this and may get pictures of the damaged service module, clues, hopefully, so exactly what went wrong can be found. Then they'll pull away with the lunar module and command module still docked. They'll do the re-entry without pressure suits, wearing their in-flight garments. Next, they'll power up the command module. Its batteries were recharged today using power from the LEM. Then all three men will crawl into the command module through the tunnel linking the two spacecraft and seal the hatches. Just before 12 noon, they'll jettison the LEM, unhooking the docking latches and using the air pressure in the tunnel to pop the two spacecraft apart. An hour later, they're due to come sweeping in over the South Pacific for re-entry, if all has gone well. If the command module is working as well as its instruments seem to say it is, waiting below the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima to recover them. It'll all happen in a few hours. And intensive simulations conducted by other astronauts on the ground these last few days say it should work. And it has to. Re-entry can't be delayed. Once they've separated from the LEM, they have only a few hours of oxygen and power left in their damaged Apollo command module. This is Jules Bergman at ABC Space Headquarters.
ABC News will be standing by around the clock to bring you extended coverage of the Apollo emergency whenever developments warrant. And continuous coverage of re-entry and splashdown will begin tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern Time.
24 hours ago, last night at this time, there was growing confidence that the Apollo 13 would make it home safely. Tonight, less than 14 hours away from its scheduled return, there is even more confidence, although, as we constantly remind ourselves, that is providing nothing else goes wrong. At the moment, the astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert, in Apollo 13, and they must feel that each hour is made up of more than 60 minutes, are about 76,500 miles away from the Earth, traveling at 4,850 miles an hour. Their course is good, but Mission Control wants it even better to lengthen the odds in their favor. And so, tomorrow morning, another small navigation correction is scheduled. Just before 8 o'clock Eastern Time, the astronauts will use some of the small engines on the spacecraft to refine their flight path even further. It should put them precisely on target for splashdown in the South Pacific just past 1 p.m. Eastern Time, but just about daylight in that part of the Pacific. Before then, however, some sleep and long conversations with Houston, step by step, on what must be done. John Chancellor of NBC News is in Houston, as he has been during this hectic week. John?
Astronauts James Lovell and John Swigert have been told to go to sleep. We are not sure where they will sleep. The command module is still cold, but the tunnel between the lunar module and the command module is a bit warmer, and possibly the off-duty astronauts are either in the tunnel or in the LEM itself. James Lovell, we heard on the box a moment ago, is awake. Astronaut Fred Haise has been going through a long checklist with Mission Control in another aspect of today's preparation for tomorrow's maneuvers.
I gather you're happy with the way things are going step by step, but just subjectively, where's your personal confidence level right now?
It's good. I'm glad to see us get this checklist stuff up. That was the last big thing to do, and from here on in, it's men and equipment performing, and so I feel confident that we'll make it.
Will you be able to recover any of the pieces of the SM that you were talking about, and if so, will they be able to give you any kind of a clue as to what happened Monday night?
No. Like I say, we don't have forces in that area. This is just hunks of metal, and when it hits, it's going to sink. So the likelihood of doing that would be nil. In fact, you just couldn't do it. And even if you did, I'd have to, after going through an entry, you couldn't tell anything about it. It'd be all burned up, mostly.
How close to the target area will the rescue ships be when it hits? In other words, if it hits exactly where you want, are the rescue ships going to be able to be in the area?
You're talking about the command module?
When the command module hits, yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll have forces on station. Aircraft carriers and helicopters and all kinds of boats.
Captain Beam, tomorrow's re-entry is going to start far more differently than any other manned re-entry. You've been through re-entry. Would you take us through it? Tell us what to look for, what to listen for.
About 6 hours prior to reaching the top of the Earth's atmosphere, we're going to start hearing a lot of talk between the command module and the lunar module. Jack will be in the command module. I think Fred and Jim will be down the lunar module and the ground, sending up some updates, switching batteries back and forth. Then, between 6 hours and about 5 hours, they'll be maneuvering the vehicle. You'll hear a lot of discussion. They'll get to the proper attitude, and then around 5 hours, they'll probably make a small burn with the RCS thrusters on the lunar module to make any last-minute corrections that need to be made before we re-enter the atmosphere. At about 1 hour, then, we're going to go to the proper separation attitude. We'll blow the LEM away from the command module just as we've always done in lunar orbit. Then you'll hear them discuss this as the LEM moves away. They'll make a star check, which will be discussed quite extensively, I think, with Houston, and then they'll move into re-entry attitude. So from that point on, we ought to hear the nominal, or the same words that we've heard for re-entries from the moon since Apollo 8.
But they may be just a shade more welcome this time.
They will. I know we're going to be glad to have them back on Earth.
Now, just a few minutes ago, the flight directors in Mission Control, where we were just looking, went around the room, as they say, asking the experts at the various consoles if anyone had any questions or comments for the astronauts. There were only a few comments. Consumables looked good, which is one of the crucial factors. The mid-course correction should be only 2.81 feet per second, less than 3 feet per second. It will be a 21-second burn on what is called the reaction control system. These are little small engines, so they have to burn longer to make that much difference in their velocity. And then the astronauts were given a good night. The recovery schedule for tomorrow morning, the mid-course correction comes at 7:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 8:23, they'll jettison the service module first. At 10:23 a.m., they'll all transfer all power over to the command module. At 11:53, they will jettison the lunar module. At 12:53, they will enter the Earth's interface. At 1:01, the drogue chute should deploy. And at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow, the splashdown in the Pacific.